Hello, good morning.
Morning.
We are live on Facebook. Good morning to everybody, or afternoon. It's 2 o'clock in the northeast of Brazil right now, but we're happy to meet you wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today, Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Can you please introduce yourself for those who know or don't know you?
Yeah, so my name is tų zaqv. I'm a Jess Housty. I am speaking to you today from Helsik Homelands in the community of Bella Bella, where I was born and raised. I am a Helsik member. I'm the executive director of Cox Project Society, which is a Helsik charitable nonprofit, and
Mhm.
I currently serve my community as an elected tribal councillor.
Mm. How long have you been a counselor?
I have been on council for 8 years.
Okay.
Mhm.
Been a while now.
Yeah, longer than I ever imagined.
And what's the women to men ratio for your council?
Oh gosh, I think we're three-quarters women.
Three quarters. And that's
Yeah,
been consistent for the last
for as long as
years,
I've been
or
on council, yeah.
so
It's
it's
been a
kind of like
majority
a
women.
woman. Mm, great. And so today I'm super interested in learning about this Granny Gardens project, which I've been hearing about in whispers.
Mhm.
So can you, just to start off, can you just let us know, how, like, what are the Granny Gardens? How did that get going in this time of COVID-19, this global health pandemic time? And then all of a sudden, you started this garden project. So what happened there?
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild story. So our nonprofit has been doing like some amount of food security work since around 2013.
Mhm.
Um, we started off with gardens at our field facilities where we would run programs for our youth and families. We branched out into a community garden that we've been operating in Bella Bella since 2017. We've been partnering for the last couple of years with our local health center on a gardening program, but things massively scaled up this year due to COVID, which was, of course, really unexpected, but has blossomed in really beautiful ways. No pun intended. Um, so in the early stages of the pandemic, I was really struggling, as were my staff and my board at Cox Society, trying to figure out what our programs could do to be of service of community when the way that we normally work is through very deep community building out on the land, which is not really possible during a pandemic. And although a lot of the programs that we would normally be running feel really tenuous right now, we don't really know what the future of those programs is going to be for 2020. The gardening program was something that we knew we could really dig deep and do well. And so since February, we've been packaging up and giving away our supplies to community members so they can have a positive hobby to focus on while they're self-isolating at home, something that promotes their mental and physical well-being, something that creates a sense of community and connection online when we can't be together. And it's just been really beautiful to see how that's evolved really quickly.
So when you receive a package, like if a family were to sign up for a package, what exactly do you receive?
We're trying to make it as low barrier as possible, ideally zero barrier. So one of the other programs that our nonprofit runs is a community sawmill, which has enabled us to make raised beds that we can sell by donation or give away for free to community members. We've been
Mhm.
bringing in pallets of soil and compost. Unfortunately, the soil on our island is very acidic and takes years to remediate to the point that it's really fertile to grow most vegetables. But we've been able to bring in a large volume of soil that we can make available to community members. And then in the really early days of the pandemic, what we did was we curated seed kits. So I had a kit of, 8 or 10 early spring veggies that were good to start in February, March. People would come up and to our office, do a contactless pickup of seeds and soil, and then receive instruction via social media or Helsik Radio or FaceTime with me to start their seeds. And then a
Mm.
little later in the spring, we gave away kits of herb seeds and then late spring veggie seeds. And the point we're at now is that we've actually built a small greenhouse so that we can just mass start seeds outside our office to give away started plants to people. So people are accessing different levels of support depending on what kind of infrastructure or knowledge they might already have in place. Some people are here for the whole package and they need the planters and the soil and the seeds and the starts and the instruction. Some people are well on their way already and need lighter support. And we're just really trying to meet community members where they're at to provide what they need.
Is it right, Jess, that over 68 families have signed up to receive these packages, to be a part of the education training around growing your own gardens?
Yeah, I double checked the
Like,
number
that's a
this
lot.
morning.
That's a
I know
lot of families.
72 households right now in Bella Bella are
Oh,
accessing some level of support, which is amazing. It's like a quarter of the community.
right. So what is the population of Bella Bella? For those who don't know, maybe like, can you tell a little bit about Bella Bella, the community itself, and what this really means for a community of that size and location?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bella Bella is on an island on the outer central coast of BC. We are ferry and plane access only. You can't drive here, of course, we're on an island. But we do rely on freight deliveries for our groceries, our fuel, our mail, all of the cargo that we need here. And so for sure, when the pandemic was, starting to unfold, all of those supply chains started to feel really tenuous. And we've been really fortunate so far that the nation's found lots of creative ways and really great partners to ensure that we still have deliveries of all the things we need. But I think it's certainly a wake-up call for a lot of people that, we're the center of our own universe in Helsing territory, but in relation to a lot of other places, we are remote. And the more self-reliant we can be, the better that will serve us.
Self-reliance for Celtic people, is that a new concept?
No,
Self-independence,
I
food
think
sovereignty.
people are like among the most stubbornly self-reliant people I've ever met. And I mean, you see all of the ways that people practice self-sufficiency and are out on the landscape harvesting ancestral resources and really striving to maintain the sense of connections to our places and resources that our ancestors have always had. And I think this is a different application of those connections and skills, but this gardening work that we're doing is really connected to the kind of broader idea of food sovereignty in our community.
Mm. Can you tell me a little bit about this garden projects has started or taken this form that it's taken this year, the same year that the SOK, the Spawn on Kelp season was canceled for this year due to COVID-19 measures. Can you explain a little bit about what happened with the SOK season this year, why it was canceled, maybe the impacts that that's had, and then how the garden project has interacted with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So many community members participate in our SOK or spawn on kelp fishery, which is our ancestral method of harvesting herring roe, where people set lines of kelp or hemlock trees for the herring to lay their eggs on and then take a percentage of those out of the water to sell commercially. It's the subject of a Supreme Court challenge that has sort of loomed large my entire life and been a huge part of our community's identity. And that SOK fishery, I think, is so core to who so many of us are as Helsik people. And there's a really amazing network of captains and fishermen who are out every year as part of that fishery and who are always taking the lead on responsible decision making around what that fishery will look like. And you've seen them go to the wall in the context of that Supreme Court challenge that they took all the way, in the context of the DFO lockdown when our members occupied the DFO station to oppose the commercial kill fishery in 2015. So it was not a light decision this year when those captains met and discussed what COVID meant for our SOK season, because at the time that this was ramping up, we were expecting dozens of members to come home from away who normally are here every year to participate in the fishery each spring. And there was just no zero risk way that we could carry out that fishery, which for those captains was a strong reason to choose to cancel it this year.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? Like how big of an impact will that be for community? Are people losing jobs? Is that a big economic driver in the community?
Absolutely. I mean, that's hundreds of members who are without that source of income, many of whom rely on that spring income every year. And, there are revenue stream, or not revenue streams, but there's, relief streams for people who've lost fishing income. But, the bureaucracy and the access challenges are really tough. And it's just hard to manage the uncertainty you're thrown into when you make a major decision like that, and you don't know where you're going to land when you leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the fishermen felt really strong that leap was necessary this year, but there was a lot of uncertainty about where we'd land.
So then in comes this Granny Garden project. Can you tell me a little bit, which, I saw there's going to be an article for those who don't know, there's going to be an article coming out very soon, a bit more about the Granny Garden project and what that's been like for the health sick community, written by Brandy Morin. But can you tell me a little bit about the name, Granny Gardens? Where did that come from?
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about the name, especially from non-Indigenous people who think it's a weird choice.
Yeah.
But I mean, I love my granny. It makes perfect sense to me.
Actually, when you say that, I have a picture of your granny, so I'll just bring her up here. She's just, tell me what she's doing here.
Oh yeah, she's 92 and definitely has mobility challenges at this age, but she was out in the sunshine laying out our black gold seaweed to dry in the sun this year, which was just amazing to see her outside. She is like my emblem of resilience, absolutely. So when we were thinking about how we were going to make the shift for our food security program this year, normally what we'd be doing is hiring some seasonal summer students to take care of our community gardens in Bala Bala. We'd be organizing in-person workshops to help build skills for people and distribute supplies, and we'd be giving away whatever produce we managed to grow in the community gardens. But we've of course really been shifting it to a household level due to COVID. And so I've been thinking for a long time about the concept of victory gardens and how you elevate the practice of growing food to be something bigger than just the act of gardening. But the name Victory Garden doesn't resonate with me. There's just a patriotism and imperialism implied in the name that I think is not consistent with the time that we're in and the place that I'm working and the community that I'm part of. And I don't honestly remember exactly how we stumbled on the name Granny Garden. I know I'd been thinking through so many options and trying to figure out what was going to kick it up a notch and give people that sense that they're participating in something bigger than themselves. And this is the name that stuck. And the reason why I have been calling it Granny Gardens is because, every health sick person who's alive today is a descendant of survivors. Our people have survived so many challenges and crises pre-contact and especially post-contact. And there's a common thread through all of that our ancestors had the strength and the knowledge they needed to survive and to thrive in spite of everything they've gone through. And when I think through to our first generation stories and our creation stories and everything that's flowed from that point onward to the moment in history that we're in now, you hear about floods and famines and natural disasters and so many things that we've withstood. And I know through all of that we had matriarchs and knowledge keepers who held the skills and the practices that were needed to sustain our people. And there's this sort of really pervasive myth out there in the world that all Indigenous people are hunter-gatherers, which I really take issue with in the context of my people, because we're not. I mean, the idea of being a hunter-gatherer just really, to me, implies this incidental and impermanent relationship with your territory and resources, which is so at odds with the deep sense of connectivity and reciprocity that I have always seen reflected in our cultural teachings and values. And so when I start thinking about the plant knowledge that our people have always held and the ability that our ancestors had to nurture communities of ancestral food plants so that they were able to thrive and that we could thrive, that to me was a really strong reminder that gardening is an ancestral practice. Gardening is a Celtic cultural practice. And although we might be applying it differently right now because we're growing different things, we are still doing our ancestors' work when we're growing carrots and tomatoes. We're just doing it in a different way. And so that's sort of the idea that I wanted to get across with the name Granny Garden. Is just an invitation to channel the resilience and the strength and creativity of the matriarchs and knowledge keepers who've always helped our people to thrive, and to remind people that what they are doing right now is their ancestors' work.
And what kinds of things were grown in before, and what kinds of things are being grown now?
So, I mean, traditionally you'd see amazing berry orchards and root gardens in the estuaries. And still to this day, when you go out on the territory, you can see thriving, abundant plant communities where you know that someone tended that in the past. And for anybody who's ever followed me on social media, they've probably seen me complain about the word untouched. It's one of my pet peeves. You often hear about our territory being untouched and pristine, which I find ridiculous. It is completely touched. The hands of our ancestors were everywhere on it. And I think the idea of berry orchards and root gardens and things like that are a prime example that you can still see the evidence that someone lovingly and knowledgeably tended plant communities out on the land. And that's what we're doing now today. And people do still harvest a lot of ancestral food plants, stinging nettles and fiddleheads and berries and all sorts of things. But generally what we've been supporting people to grow through the Granny Garden project is herbs and vegetables. And we've also been doing a little bit of work over the last few years to revitalize old fruit trees in the community so that we can have access to local fruit.
And it's one of those things, the untouched. It's one of those colonial sayings. It's like the middle of nowhere. Oh, I'm in the middle of nowhere. It's like, no, you're on somebody's territory. Like you're on somebody's backyard. Like go away. I'm in the middle of nowhere. Very, very mystic, remote place. Yes, thank you so much for sharing. So can you tell me a little bit about some of the other programs that you're involved in? I know that just from creeping you quite a bit and following your work over the last year is being familiar with some of the projects that you're involved in. Organizing isn't really a new thing. It's not like COVID-19, you just started organizing. You've been organizing for a minute now. And so what are some of the things that you've been involved in the community? I'll let you answer that there.
Yeah. I meddle in a lot of things. I grew up in Cox Project Society, the Celtic nonprofit that I mentioned earlier in our chat. And in the last year, I've stepped into an executive director role in the organization, which is new for me and a really exciting challenge. And a lot of the work that Cox does is very focused on supporting Celtic youth and families to strengthen their sense of connection to their cultural identity and strengthen their confidence to be leaders and stewards in their own territory. And so the core program that we've been running for 22 years is the Quay River Youth Camp, which is a cultural camp out on the land. But we also operate the Quay Sanctuary, which is former fishing lodge that we rebuilt to be a family and community healing center out in the land. We run the little community library that I'm in right now, which is currently doubling as a greenhouse. And the work that we do as an organization really shifts to meet where the community's at. We consider ourselves to have a really open mandate with the intent that if a community member or another agency in Bella Bella comes to us and says, we've identified this gap, we need this program, we need this project, this work needs to get done, it can't we can't do it right now.
Mhm.
We like to be the people who say, okay, we'll figure something out. And so a lot of times what we do is the startup phase of projects and programs. And once they are established based on the community feedback we've received, and we're able to secure robust funding for them, we actually love to hand them over to other organizations to carry forward so that we're freed up to innovate with new things. So the roster of projects and programs that we run changes year to year, but our core program has always been that Queer River Youth Camp program. So in my Cox capacity, that's what I've been involved in. And then for the last 8 years, I've been an elected tribal councillor, which is not something that I ever explicitly aspired to do. But in the really early days of organizing around Enbridge Northern Gateway, that felt like a natural next step and additional table that I could be at to help our nation assert its position on that pipeline project. And that was a big part of my motivation for running for council. And for as long as I've been on council, I've been involved with the lands portfolio and the youth portfolio. So it really feels like an extension of work that I'm doing elsewhere outside of council, but very focused on Helsik land-based governance and asserting Helsik sovereignty by supporting our youth to be leaders and supporting our territory to thrive.
So you talked a little bit about this moment in history. What are your thoughts around where we are right now? What are your thoughts around COVID-19? I mean, I know people were probably sick of talking about it, but this is the reality that we're in, right? This is the reality no matter where you are in the world. So any thoughts around what led us here today? And then perhaps from your perspective, what needs to be done now in this moment of transition in order to step into a more sustainable tomorrow?
It's certainly been a huge wake-up call for me that I need to rethink my relationship to my family, my community, my territory, so that I can be of greater service to the people and places that I care about. Because if this pandemic situation has taught me anything, it's that we can't rely on anyone outside our community. I've really struggled with seeing how other levels of government and corporations have responded to this situation in a way that does not protect or uplift or equitably address the challenges of marginalized people, including our own community. And on the other side of that coin, I've watched our nation respond in a way that is very progressive and forward-thinking and strong, but also very compassionate. And that, to me, really models the kind of leadership that I wish I saw in the wider world. But I'm really proud that I can play some small part in that here. And yeah, I think it's just, to me, a really deep call to bring more kindness and more local service-based focus into my work.
So when you talk about you've lived through a faulty, probably at best, government response to needs in your territories and homelands, what are some examples that you're speaking to where there's been inadequate support and response and where you've seen your community leadership really step up?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the perfect example is around our local emergency orders. And if you look, I mean, anywhere, but if you look around the Central Coast, Helsik and our neighboring communities have all taken very strong positions on COVID-19 and protective measures that need to be put in place. You see Kitasoo and Newhawk and Wekino and Helsik all really wanting to respond from a place of deep caution and a need to protect our people. And at the same time, there have been municipal levels of government. For us, it's the Central Coast Regional District, which has looked around the coast and said, you know what, you guys know what you need. So we're gonna declare a local state of emergency and design emergency orders that can empower what your nations are doing, because you know what needs to happen to protect this area. And there was amazing collaboration happening between our tribal governments and the Central Coast Regional District to inform a really powerful, locally developed response for our region. And then the province said, hey, we're actually going to rescind all local states of emergency. We're going to have a provincial response. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, what BC-wide response has ever been able to adequately address the needs of small Indigenous communities? Like, where is the guarantee that we're not going to be left behind? And like, where is the trust from the province in our ability to show the leadership that's needed here and to implement the emergency orders that will adequately protect our community? There's no way someone in Victoria can imagine and implement an effective strategy. And it really felt like the province was just kneecapping the leadership of our nations and the municipal government that was really fighting to empower what we were doing. And I know that that didn't just impact our region. I've heard the same frustration from Haida Gwaii and I mean all across BC. And it's been incredibly frustrating that no amount of lobbying, no amount of reasoning has got us an inch with the province and motivated them to say, hey, maybe we were wrong. Maybe the best way to address emergency protective measures is at a local level. And so, as usual, it feels like our Indigenous nations and governments have been left on the front lines to enforce our own emergency orders, our own laws, with no support from anyone else. And if you look at the pressure that we're facing as we're trying to implement those emergency orders, it's not from our own people. It's from Americans on mega yachts who are fleeing civilization and showing up in our community wanting groceries and fuel. It's people who are outside our territory and coming in with all of the risk that that entails. And we're left alone to try to enforce our emergency orders with absolutely no support. And it's not new. We've seen that before. We saw that with trophy hunting when our nations all unanimously declared in the North Central Coast that trophy hunting for bears was not consistent with our laws and was illegal under our laws. And no amount of lobbying the province for the longest time resulted in any kind of regulatory change to reflect that. It took years and years of lobbying to make even marginal progress on that for them to align with the leadership and governance of the nations. And we don't have years and years of lobbying time to enable that kind of support and alignment right now.
When you're talking about community being supported to deal with emergency situations or any kind of situation that could happen again in the future, are you talking specifically about the Marine Response Center that the nation was trying to get support for? And what would that look like, that Marine? Can you tell me a little bit more about that response center?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of, our nation learning from terrible history and trying to implement positive, proactive solutions. So in October 2016, our worst fears were realized and we experienced a diesel spill in the northern part of our territory. An American-owned articulated tug barge ran aground due to negligence and spilled about 110,000 liters of diesel and about 5,000 liters of heavy oil into an area that our community knows is the breadbasket of our nation, where we harvest dozens of marine and intertidal species. And I was the incident commander for HealthSec for most of the 40-day emergency phase. And, I mean, I think it's very clear in our media response and the legal challenge that we launched. And I don't think it's hard to research HealthSec's position on this, but the response was incredibly flawed. There were so many missteps and jurisdictional spats and delays and just issues that really slowed down an effective response. And, I watched hundreds of community members give it their all for that entire emergency phase, doing everything they possibly could to try to mitigate what was happening, this situation that we did not ask for and now had to address. And it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking and traumatic. And coming out the other side, I'm incredibly proud of lots of the proactive things that our community did, including launching our own investigation into the first 48 hours of the incident, assembling an adjudication committee of health knowledge keepers to assess whether any of the incidents that occurred in those first 48 hours were a contravention of health law. And I'm also incredibly proud of the work that was done to envision what an effective response might have looked like, and to come up with a proposal for Indigenous-led marine emergency response on the Central Coast. And that's work that we started immediately after the spill in 2016. And my feeling is that there has been next to no support from any level of government or anyone outside the community, which is tragic. I feel like we were made into this cautionary tale with nobody willing to do the work to actually prevent it from happening again or empower us to respond better if we're faced with a similar situation in the future.
Well, I saw a video of, John Horgan and you in conversation, and you explaining this 9 days after this traumatic event, and him saying to your face and saying on screen, sounds like you need to be empowered to do what your folks know how to do, to have the resources to be able to deal with this kind of thing if it happens again in the future. I mean, he said that right to your face. Since then, what has his position been from the years following?
Yeah, so at that point when the spill happened, I think we were leading up to election time, and my strong feeling was that he was very much in campaign mode and willing to say whatever he needed to say to seem sympathetic to people. At the time, I felt like we had a very honest discussion, and I was extremely hopeful that it would lead to him being an informed and empowered advocate. And I haven't seen that materialize in ways that are remotely satisfying to me.
What about the programs that now, with everything happening with COVID-19, there were some programs like is it the Consult wellness program that was supposed to be taking place this fall 2020 out on the land? What are the conversations happening with the new social distancing measures and quarantine measures?
Yeah, so the information changes so quickly, it's so hard to plan ahead for any kind of programs. But just for a little bit of context, one of the projects that we've been very involved in at our nonprofit over the last couple of years is the construction of a new wellness center for the health sick people. It's located very close to Bella, about 15 minutes by boat. And we've been operating our field facility down in the Quay watershed since the early 2000s, and really seen the benefit of having a safe, comfortable space out on the land for families and elders and community members to go and do their work and be together for all kinds of programs, not just programs run by our nonprofit, but by other community partners as well. One of the challenges with our space in Quay is that it's about an hour and a half by boat, and it's only accessible about 6 months of the year, just due to weather. And there's always been this sort of really long-term hope that we could have a similar scale of facility, but close enough to Bella Bella that it's really accessible, both logistically and for all mobility levels. And so the Consult project is sort of the culmination of that long-term vision. Our nonprofit was able to secure infrastructure dollars, which are pretty hard to come by, to build the initial facility. And we've been project managing the construction since February 2019. We had, pre-COVID, our plan was to have the facility operational enough to start running day programs and weekend programs into the spring and summer, with the first phase of construction being completed in the fall. And there's a really amazing group that's supporting that wellness center. So because we wanted it to be really deeply collaborative, what we are doing is actually starting a new organization in the community. So we have the Cox Wellness Society, which has representation from all of the local agencies that we envision running programs out there. Whether it's, in a governance capacity, we have our hereditary chiefs and matriarchs and tribal council represented at the table. Our youth center, health center, social development, child and family services, the school, like everybody is at the table together, jointly designing a space that all of them can use for their programs, which was just such an amazing project to be working on and an amazing beacon of hope to have so close in the future. And it's been a fight to figure out how we can continue developing that project due to COVID. We had a substantial crew of local people who were part of that construction and doing labor work over there. And what we've been able to do so far is change how people are working and where people are working. So we've been able to sort of decentralize a lot of the construction. We have people working from home. We're having lumber dropped off to them so they can complete small projects remotely that then go over to the site and get fitted into place. It's a big enough work site that we are able to have very small, physically distant crews working on site together. We've changed our safety protocols so that we're able to sanitize things more frequently. And it's been a challenge. It's been a real juggling act. And so in a reduced capacity and with some logistical challenges, we have been able to carry on the construction phase, but we don't know what programming is going to look like. We were really hopeful that by now we'd be running day programs and weekend programs over there. And, we're following the advice of our Health Emergency Operations Center on what will be appropriate for us in terms of activities we can undertake this spring. And my blue sky dream is that if we are able to form enough of a protective bubble around our community that we're sort of isolated from a lot of the risk, that we might be able to do small group programming out on the land in the late spring and summer. I don't know if that'll happen, but I'm very hopeful we'll be able to do something.
But it sounds like people have been adapting, in this time, that adaptation isn't really a new concept.
Yeah, and it's been really funny how that has manifested in terms of the gardening work in particular. So, I think I mentioned that normally in the late spring and summer, we would have teams of, high school and post-secondary students who would be doing community garden support work and home garden support work in the community. And we've still been able to carry that on to a certain extent. So we have several community garden spaces in Bella Bella. And what we've been able to do is hire a team of physically distant gardeners. So we have teenagers who are amazing green thumbs and so hardworking, and they are championing different community garden spaces. We're adding a little to their wages to cover their data so they can FaceTime me from the garden and send lots of pictures of what they're doing. And it's really not the kind of hands-on mentorship that we like to practice when it comes to employing young people, but we have been able to keep some people working and keep kids engaged in that program through that physically distant gardening. So it's working for now. And in terms of how we're delivering the gardening tutorials, normally we would be doing a couple dozen workshops every year where we'd be bringing people together in one of the community gardens or in our youth center to do skill building around different aspects of gardening. And, obviously we can't do that right now. So there is a series of just ridiculous gardening tutorials of me. Community members come to me with questions on how to do something with their garden. I research it. I shoot an instructional video.
What are some of the questions that you're getting? Like, what are some of the questions?
A lot of it's really simple stuff like, how do you know when to transplant your seedlings? What are your options for planting potatoes? How do I thin my seedlings out? Just little things like that. And
what are the answers to all those questions?
The funny thing is,
for people who might be taking notes,
for me, the really funny thing is, like, I actually don't know that much about gardening.
Right.
I think it's a lot of fun, but I'm usually
Yeah.
just like a Google search ahead of everybody else.
Right.
There are amazing resources out there and online classes you can take, but I really find that people respond better to a familiar face, uh,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's a familiar face who's making a fool of themselves. I mean, the videos are unscripted. I'm doing my best. People are very patient and only tease me a little bit, but it's been really neat to be building a sense of connection that way. And we've also been uploading some audio to Helsik Radio, which is broadcasting on FM for our community. And I do a lot of like video calls and FaceTime support for people in their gardens. And yeah, it's fun, and you just adapt to the tools that you have at hand. And I miss people. I miss seeing people. I miss having those workshops because they were always so much fun, and we'd share food and do activities together and have lots of laughs.
I miss people too.
But amazingly, like somehow this is still making me feel like incredibly connected to people.
Yes. Yeah.
And the spectrum of people who are participating in the Granny Garden program, there's lots of people who aren't normally participating in our programs. A lot of the programs that we normally run are very youth oriented, and so all of a sudden I'm interacting with like the parents of campers that I would normally be seeing all the time in the summer. It's building community, which is really neat. And it's also kind of cool that I get to see pictures of everybody's gardens. So like, I've never been in lots of people's yards, but I know what they look like, and I can be there to cheer on their rhubarb growing or their lettuce coming up or their pumpkins. And yeah, it's amazing how much more connected it's made me feel to people at a time when I don't get to see them in person.
So once this is all, I don't know, that's what we're saying. Once this is all over, like we're not going back to normal. Like this is, sometimes you wake up and you think about the time that we're living in this part of this cycle, and you're like, is this a dream? But there was so many things pre-COVID that were more stranger than fiction anyways, right? Like there's a reason why things weren't working out. And I think having your hands even in the earth, right now at this time, like I think there's people that are planting and there's people that aren't. And I'm really interested in hearing from the people that are planting, because I think those are really important conversations to have right now. So what does Indigenous food security, what does that even mean for you? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. And, people talk a lot about food sovereignty as a practice. And I mean, a lot of that is about what you harvest. And I would never downplay the importance of our ancestral foods, because those are sacred medicines, those nourish us. And so one side of the coin with food sovereignty absolutely is, what are you harvesting? Sorry, someone's knocking at my door to pick up seedlings right now. But the other side of it is also how you're harvesting and the systems of knowledge that are informing and empowering you in your food systems work. And so for me, I think that's one side that I can tackle right now, is helping to build some of those skills and that self-reliance around growing food and nourishing things to thrive. And so part of food sovereignty is absolutely about the things that physically nourish you, but it's also about the knowledge that empowers you and all of the things that support your holistic wellness.
Okay, I want to talk about, it's probably just because it's like it's past lunchtime now, but can you tell me about this dish? And then afterwards, I just want to talk about some recipes, because I've seen that you've been sharing some recipes on Twitter, and I want to hear about anything new that you've learned or tried out.
Yeah. So this dish on the screen was my dinner from the other night. I've become one of those people who like Instagrams their meals, but I felt like this one was worthy. This is smoked salmon and spot prawn.
Oh my goodness.
Nettle pesto. So I know it was it was so good. It was so good. So the smoked salmon and the spot prawns were a gift that was dropped off to my family by a harvester, which oh my gosh, I'm so lucky. And the nettle pesto, I love stinging nettles. I know they make a lot of people nervous, but I've got a really beautiful patch in my yard, and I do have 2 young kids, and so it's been a lot of work teaching them to identify what they can and can't be poking around in. But Yeah, I've always dried it for tea and often, blanched it and kept some in the freezer. But I wanted to try some new recipes this year, and nettle pesto seemed really amazing. So it's really similar, as a recipe to normal basil pesto, but you swap in the nettles, and it's like an explosion of springtime in your mouth. It is just
Wow.
so green and so vital and amazing. It's just delicious.
Delicious. So what else are you growing and making? I saw rhubarb. You said you're making jams. I thought I love rhubarb pie. Like I
Mhm.
love pie, right? I'm a big pie fan. Just a piece of pie with a coffee. Perfect. So tell me about other things that you've been making.
Yeah, I am a big fan of preserves and jams. Actually, my very favorite jam that I make is if I can like hold myself back from eating all my rhubarb when it's fresh and freeze some, making a blend of rhubarb and gooseberry jam is just
Mm.
so good. Um, but we've been experimenting with all different kinds of really neat jams and jellies here. Probably the fan favorite in our household is the fireweed jelly, which we make from the blossoms, and it's just like beautiful, bright pink jelly that just
Yum.
is delicious. So we're really fortunate that we have access to lots of marine and intertidal protein, but figuring out how to incorporate more, local plants and homegrown stuff into our diet is just it's a lot of fun. And our rhubarb is the first thing to come up, but we've got lots of greens that are getting really close. I've got tons of squash in the ground, and yeah, tons of stuff.
Let me throw up this picture of
It's
delicious.
been a really interesting journey for me because there's sort of been this like really pervasive idea out there that like it's too rainy here and too cold here to grow anything. You hear that
Mm.
we don't have a good growing season here. We can't garden here, which is just like not true at all. You can grow so many things. We actually have a pretty long growing season, all things considered. It's not always
Mhm.
as warm as you'd like it to be, so you can't necessarily grow things that require a really long, hot growing season. But we do really well with peas and beans and all kinds of greens. Unintentional poem there. Summer squashes, winter squashes, potatoes, um, carrots, root veggies, beets, radishes, like tons of stuff. And my sort of next stage of my personal journey with all of that is just figuring out more ways to preserve it so that I'm not just self-reliant with my produce while it's growing and fresh, but also, it's there to support my family's well-being into the winter as well. So learning more about preserving those foods is, yeah, it's a good goal.
Mm. On a global scale, Jess, like, do you think these are lessons that we globally are really understanding that local really is the only sustainable action, and that the way that agribusiness has been functioning in the world can't last, and is totally related to climate change and a warming climate and health pandemics? Do you think these are lessons that we're really understanding right now in this time?
I hope so. It's funny. Like you can walk into the grocery store in Bella Bella and you can find like produce from New Zealand. And
Mm.
when you stop and think about like if you read the labels on that fresh stuff and think about how far it's traveled and the footprint for it to get here and all of the weird things that happen to enable it to travel that far and still be reasonably preserved. And then, the fact that it finally gets here and the cost is so high and the
Mhm.
quality is often so low. You just have to wonder like why why would we do that? And so that's a journey for me and for our organization that definitely predates COVID, although this really throws it into rapid focus because it sort of feels like all of our freight systems and supply chains are so much more tenuous now than they felt 6 months ago.
Mhm.
But we have everything that we need here. And that might mean giving up some luxuries that we've become accustomed to. And it
Mhm.
might mean getting used to the fact that homegrown food doesn't always look as picture perfect as what gets selected into your grocery store. But
Mhm.
the nutritional value of the things that we grow is so high. And all of the secondary benefits are so amazing. I mean, you see
Yeah.
this really impacting people's physical health as they're getting outside and they're in the fresh air. It's good for your mental health. It's therapeutic. I mean, for me, my journey to really taking gardening seriously was at a time after the Nathan E. Stewart oil spill when I was, struggling with a PTSD diagnosis and just felt like I didn't have a sense of agency and control in my life, period, but over food security in particular, as I was seeing the devastation of one of the most abundant parts of our territory. And so for me, a big part of my journey to gardening was about learning skills that made me feel like I had a sense of control over my personal food security. Recognizing that carrots and peas and potatoes can't replace all of the amazing ancestral foods that are out in the territory and at risk from things like oil spills. But for me, it was a signal to myself that I can take care of myself. I can take care of my family. I can take care of the people around me. And so the emotional and mental and spiritual importance of growing food for me has just been immense. And I think that's something that you're never going to get from walking to a grocery store and strolling down the produce aisle.
Would you like to see other communities take up something like the Granny Garden Project in their own communities? Have you been having any conversations with other folks?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of my favorite things is, chatting with people in other communities who are doing similar work or aspire to do similar work. And I've learned so much from, watching what people are doing in other communities. I'm part of a couple of regional networks where I've been able to share out about what we're doing here and, being able to provide some support to folks in other communities as well, either in the form of knowledge or we've actually been mailing seeds if we have excess seeds of certain kinds, just because seed suppliers are so overrun right now that often it's quicker for me to mail a few packages of kale seeds to someone in another community than it is for them to wait for those backlogged orders to come through. And we're here. Anything we can do to support people who want to do good work in their communities, like I love doing that.
I mean, I think there's something, I think it's the clearest message right now. If your freezer is full, if your cupboards are full of preserved foods, if that knowledge is around you, if that's something you're protecting, you're in the right place right now. And I think everyone needs to be making steps, back towards that knowledge and providing energy and resources for those who have carried and protected that knowledge for so long, those knowledges, depending on where you are. So I really hope that this message is heard loud and clear and that people are encouraged to plant, to put their hands back in the earth and to, just to share these stories about boosting morale in these times as well, because they are difficult, strange times, and it's important for us to feel that sense of connection to each other, like you said, to yourself, to ourselves, to nature, to be connected in this time. So do you have any other thoughts that you want to share before we kind of come to a close with this conversation?
I think a couple of really great things. One is just I really have to acknowledge how amazing my community members are because I get to be the face in the wider world of a lot of what's happening here, but I'm actually like a very small part of what's going on. I mean, I think I mentioned we're up to 72 homes in the community that are taking on gardening work, and they're doing amazing things, like far above and beyond what I as one person could ever support or enable. And the resilience and the creativity and the passion of all of those people is just like blows me out of the water every day. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is knowing that I get to play some small part in supporting those people. And for those who know a little bit about the history of Bella Bella as a community, pre-contact we had over 50 villages spread throughout a quite substantial territory. We have a large territory. And post-contact, after waves of disease, we saw our numbers dwindle from probably over 10,000 people down to fewer than 200. And at that time, I mean, people couldn't live spread out on a massive territory with so few people. And you saw people begin to move into Bella Bella and gather here as a community. And so the history of our community and the history of every Helsik person here is really rooted in being a survivor of epidemics. Like that is just so ingrained in our community identity and in our human identity here. Whether or not it's something we think about explicitly, every Helsik person who's alive today is part of like the 1% of healthy people who survived epidemics. And I see that strength and that resilience being reflected in just like magical ways in my community members who are just doing such amazing things and finding ways to thrive no matter what they're faced with. And that's just such an incredible thing. And my only other thought is that, you know, we talk a lot about relationships and about community building and communities of gardeners sharing knowledge and, you know, connections across communities. But I think it's also important to remember that we have relationships to plants as well, that there is a kinship there, and that in honoring that and in being really intentional in your food systems work really helps your plants to thrive and you to thrive. And it's a very reciprocal relationship because it is very rooted in a deep sense of kinship. And I've really gained a lot from deepening my relationship with, you know, the plant communities around me. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the teachings that led me to that.
Thank you so much, Jess, for your time and for letting us know what you've been up to there in Bella Bella. I look forward to reading the article and sharing the article around and following your work, because it seems like you never stop. So I'm going to be following your work from afar and look forward to catching up soon to hearing what you're going to be involved in. Feel free to keep us posted, you know, as the numbers grow and more families get involved. You know, I'm just so excited to see what these little seedlings are going to bloom into. You know, a lot of people are involved in investing in life right now and sustainability and, like you said, thriving, not just surviving. So really grateful for your time.
Kä.
Hi. Take care.